Chapter 1. The Slave Market. The scorching twin suns of the desert planet Vriathos cast their merciless rays down onto the sprawling, chaotic market that sprawled out before them. The sounds of bartering, haggling, and the clanking of metal filled the air, a strange melody of alien voices and mechanical whirs that made it hard to focus on any one thing. This was the infamous Vriathos slave market, a place where the rich and powerful from across the galaxy came to purchase everything from rare artifacts to rare creatures, from war machines to sentient beings, those deemed too dangerous or too valuable to be left free, those whose lives had been traded away before they even understood the meaning of choice. As the crowd surged around, the stalls were filled with strange sights. Weapons that hummed with alien energy, crates filled with unidentifiable goods that radiated a faint glow, and the unmistakable presence of beings who had been brought to this place for one simple reason: profit. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat and dust, thick with the mingling odors of countless species, each of them either contributing to or profiting from the cruel transaction that took place here. But amidst the noise and the fury, the most striking feature of this market was something that was, perhaps, even more valuable than any other commodity: the slaves. The orator, the auctioneer of this infernal bazaar, stood at the front of the grand stage, his dark eyes scanning the crowd of potential buyers. He was tall, regal, his attire immaculate despite the filthy conditions of the market around him. His voice rang out over the crowd, effortlessly drawing the attention of all those who had gathered to see what new acquisitions were being offered today. His tone was smooth, practiced, the cadence of a man who had done this too many times to count. He knew what would capture the buyer's attention. He knew how to sell a slave. "Step forward," he boomed, his hand sweeping out to indicate the next lot of the day. The finest the market has to offer. Rare, exotic, and as always, perfect for the discerning buyer. His voice carried across the field, effortlessly rising above the cacophony of voices. The crowd hushed as the next slave was presented, the shackled figure being shoved forward roughly by two hulking guards, the sound of chains scraping against the dusty ground like a death knell. The woman was brought before the crowd, and a collective gasp rippled through the audience. She was unlike anything most of the people in this crowd had ever seen. Tall, even by alien standards, with skin that shimmered with a dull green tint, and a fierce gaze that could pierce the heart of even the most hardened of individuals. She stood there with her hands bound at her back, looking defiantly at the world around her. Her muscles, visibly defined beneath the thin rags she wore, betrayed the strength within her. The Zavka were known to be fierce warriors. Their species evolved for battle, with reflexes and physical prowess that made them almost unrivaled in combat. But this woman Zyra, they called her, was a failure, according to her previous masters. She had fought back too much. She had resisted too much. In the eyes of the buyers in the market, that made her less valuable than those who were docile, obedient. The Zavka women were rare, seen as a prize for any who could break them, and yet there was something in Zyra's eyes, something too untamed, that kept her from fitting into the mold others had expected her to. She had fought, and in doing so, she had become a thing to be discarded, a piece of merchandise no one wanted, no one could truly control. And that, in the eyes of the buyers here, made her a risk too dangerous, too unpredictable. Her eyes were locked on the orator, her gaze unwavering. Despite the chains that bound her, the bruises and cuts that marred her skin from days of mistreatment, there was an undeniable strength in her presence. She stood tall, refusing to cower, even as she was paraded before the crowd like some prized animal. To the onlookers, she was a curiosity, something to be examined, something to be bought and tamed. To Zyra, it was just another moment of cruelty in a world that had already taken so much from her. The orator smiled as he moved to the podium, preparing to begin his sales pitch. His hands rested easily on the polished wood as he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the last of the Zavka warriors. Captured, subdued, and, I assure you, thoroughly broken. This specimen was the pride of her people, but as you can see, she's been tamed. She no longer poses a threat to you." He flashed a smile that did nothing to hide the coldness in his eyes. "She is fierce, yes, but even the fiercest of warriors can be bent to the will of their masters. The finest physical specimen of her species, perfect for your army or your private collection. There was a murmur of interest from the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others whispering among themselves. Zyra's chest tightened, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. This was the moment. Her future would be decided here, in front of these strangers, these monsters who valued her life like a simple commodity. They didn't care who she was, what she had been through, what her people had suffered. They only cared about her strength, her usefulness. And in the end, she knew that if no one here bought her, she would be discarded, used for parts, sold for scrap, forgotten. She had seen it happen to others. The orator's voice rose again, louder, more confident. Now, let us talk about the price. For a woman like this, you won't find better in the entire galaxy. A mere 20,000 credits is all it takes to own her. And think of the possibilities, the power she could bring to your personal army, your combat force. Imagine what a few months of proper training could achieve. This is the kind of warrior who could turn the tide of any battle. He motioned for one of the guards to approach with a small, hollow projector. A projection of Zyra in combat appeared, her form agile and powerful, moving with a grace that betrayed her size. She was an unstoppable force, no one could deny that. But the image that flickered before the crowd only reminded Zyra of what she had once been and now, what she was being reduced to. A tool. A weapon. A whisper spread through the crowd, and the bidding began. The price slowly climbed as men and women from different corners of the galaxy began offering their credits. Zyra's heart sank with each increase, her head spinning with the realization that she would soon be owned, controlled, manipulated into something she was never meant to be. Her resolve, so firm just moments ago, was crumbling under the weight of the situation. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the feeling of helplessness threatening to overtake her. But then, just as the price reached a staggering 25,000 credits, a new voice cut through the air, deep and authoritative, pulling everyone's attention back to the front. "I'll take her," came the voice, firm and unwavering, echoing through the hall like a force of nature. The crowd fell silent, turning toward the new bidder. There was a brief, confused pause before the orator looked over to the man who had spoken, his eyes narrowing with both suspicion and curiosity. "You wish to purchase her, sir?" the orator asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "She is not for the faint of heart. She will need proper training. Not everyone can handle a Zavka." The man who had spoken stood up from the shadows. He was tall, dressed in dark, practical attire, his eyes obscured by the deep shadows of his hood. There was something about him that radiated authority, but also secrecy. He didn't look like the kind of man who would engage in the business of the slave trade. There was a calmness to his demeanor, a confidence that seemed out of place in the chaos of the auction. "I am aware of the challenges," he replied, his voice smooth and cold, yet carrying an undercurrent of something more, something unreadable. "But I can assure you, I have no intention of merely owning her. She will be more than just an asset." The orator raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more. He had seen all kinds of buyers in his time, and this man seemed different. Unconventional, perhaps, but in the end, credits were credits, and a sale was a sale. "Very well," the orator said, his voice dripping with the satisfaction of a successful transaction. "The woman is yours. The bid is closed." And just like that, Zyra's fate was sealed. Zyra stood still, her body aching from days of being marched and shackled, her mind consumed by the numbness that had become her defense against the cruel reality of her existence. She had long since learned that any display of emotion, any sign of resistance, would only bring more pain. She had once been a warrior, strong and proud, trained to fight for her people, but now she was nothing more than a commodity, sold to the highest bidder like an object, not a living being with hopes or dreams. The orator's voice rang out once more, cutting through her thoughts. "This Zavka warrior is unlike any you've seen before. Powerful, strong, and, despite her resistance, utterly capable of being molded into something even greater. Look at her. See the muscle, the grace, the raw potential." His words were honeyed, the sales pitch practiced and smooth, designed to make Zyra seem like an opportunity, something to be used and exploited. But Zyra didn't see herself that way anymore. She had been sold to one man after another, only to be thrown away each time because of her fierce independence. The Zavka had been born to fight, But the galaxy didn't want fighters who refused to bend, who refused to submit to authority. Her pride had made her valuable in some ways, but ultimately, it had also made her disposable. And now, in front of a crowd of strangers, she was being judged once again. Her heart hardened against the bitter truth. "Look at her," the orator continued. "Her race can be molded into an unstoppable force perfect for armies, perfect for those seeking to assert their dominance." The bidding began. Zyra's eyes flicked over the crowd of onlookers, many of them clearly interested, but none showing the kind of desire or excitement she had seen in others who had been purchased. Most were looking at her with something akin to fear, perhaps because they had heard stories of her kind. Zavka were powerful, too powerful for most, and their violence could not be easily contained. They were not the kind of people you bought and hoped to control. The numbers began to rise, and Zyra's heart sank lower with every digit. She knew how this ended. She had been here too many times before, too many times to hope that her fate could change. But when the bidding reached an astonishing price, far higher than any of her previous owners had ever paid for her, Zyra's eyes snapped up, drawn to the man who had entered the crowd. He was tall, wearing simple, well-worn clothes that seemed out of place amidst the ostentatious wealth of the others in the room. His eyes were hidden behind the shadow of his hood, but his stance was confident, and his quiet presence commanded attention. He wasn't like the others, wealthy men looking to buy slaves for sport or use in their personal collections. There was something about the way he moved, the way his hands were folded calmly in front of him, that caught Zyra's attention. The auctioneer's voice interrupted her thoughts. 28,000 credits. Do I hear 30? And then the figure spoke, his voice calm but firm. I'll take her. The orator blinked, then looked at the man, surprised by the sudden, confident declaration. You'll take her? At that price? Are you certain, sir? This is an extremely dangerous acquisition. I can assure you, she has been dashed. I don't need your assurances, the man interrupted, his voice low but carrying a weight that made the orator pause. I'll take her. Do I need to say it again? The crowd fell silent, and the orator hesitated. Sold, then, he muttered, his voice laced with confusion. He hadn't expected such a swift transaction. It wasn't the kind of bidding war he usually encouraged, but there was something about the man's words that had made him give in. Zyra's heart raced as she stared at the man who had just purchased her. She was in shock, unable to process what had just happened. For the first time, someone had chosen her without hesitation. But who was he? What did he want with a Zavka woman who had been deemed too dangerous, too wild to be tamed? As the man stepped forward to claim her, she couldn't help but feel a strange mix of fear and curiosity. She had been traded from one hand to another all her life, but now she was in the hands of a stranger whose motivations were unclear. He didn't look like the other buyers, wealthy, arrogant men who saw her as nothing more than a tool. There was something in his gaze that told her he saw more than her power. There was something he had noticed, something that none of her previous owners had cared to uncover. Come, he said quietly, his voice commanding yet strangely kind. We're leaving this place. He didn't look back to see if she followed. He simply turned, and Zyra had no choice but to follow. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the immediate rush of fear and hatred. The thought that she might be useful to someone again on her own terms was unsettling, but also strangely comforting. Chapter 2. Training the Unbroken. The journey from the slave market to the man's estate was long, but it was far different from the days of torment that Zyra had experienced in the past. The transport vehicle was far more comfortable than anything she had been in before, and as she sat there, shackled but unguarded, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The man whose name she had yet to learn sat across from her, his face still hidden in shadow beneath his hood. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and curiosity. Zyra wasn't sure what to think of him. He was not like the other buyers, those who sought her out for their own purposes, to use her strength for their wars or pleasures. There was no cruelty in his eyes, no lust for dominance. He had simply made his purchase, and now, he seemed content to let the silence hang in the air, as if waiting for her to speak first. She could feel his gaze on her every now and then, but she didn't meet it. Not yet. She had been bought, yes, but she wasn't a docile slave. She wasn't going to submit, no matter how kind or cruel her new owner seemed. Her strength was her own. She wasn't going to let anyone control her again. The ship, or whatever vehicle they were in, finally slowed, its engines humming as it came to a halt in front of a large, imposing building. The estate looked like something out of a high-tech fortress, surrounded by high walls and reinforced gates. Zyra had been to many places in her life, but this was unlike anything she had seen. It wasn't a place where slaves were kept. It wasn't a place where people were bought and sold. There was something different about this place, something that didn't sit quite right with the way she had been treated in the past. The man stood, stretching his long limbs as he turned toward her. "We've arrived," he said simply, as if it were just another day. "You'll stay here from now on. I don't expect you to be happy about it, but if you can prove yourself, you'll find that there's more at stake than just your freedom." Zyra didn't respond. Instead, she stood and followed him as they made their way toward the building. The guards at the gates didn't look at her. They didn't even acknowledge her presence. This was a place of power, and Zyra, despite the uncertainty she felt, could tell that things were about to change for her. Inside the estate, the atmosphere shifted. Everything was clean, polished, almost pristine in its sterile beauty. The walls were lined with intricate designs and technology she couldn't fathom, alien machines that hummed softly, like they were alive. There was no warmth here, no sign of life beyond the cold efficiency of the systems. "Sit," the man commanded, gesturing to a chair in the center of a small room. As she did, the door closed behind her, leaving only the man standing in front of her. "You're here because I see something in you," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I'm not interested in making you a servant. I'm interested in making you a warrior. A Zavka like you has potential more than anyone here realizes. You'll train. You'll fight. You'll become the weapon you were always meant to be." Zyra felt the weight of his words sink in. A warrior? She had never thought of herself as anything but that. But a weapon? The concept was foreign to her. She had always fought for survival, for her people, for freedom. But now, she was nothing more than an object to be shaped and honed. But then, something inside her stirred. Could she become more than just a slave? More than just a pawn? Could she regain the control that had been taken from her? Could she become the warrior she had always been meant to be, on her own terms? The man's voice cut through her thoughts. "You'll begin your training immediately. There's a lot to be done." Zyra looked at him, her gaze hardening, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to speak. "I will not be your weapon," she said softly, but firmly. The man regarded her for a long moment, and then, surprisingly, a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "We'll see about that." And just like that, Zyra's journey took a new turn. She wasn't broken. She wasn't a tool. She was something more. And the man who had bought her would soon learn that turning her into a warrior would be no easy task. But she was willing to fight. For herself. For her freedom. For her people. And maybe, just maybe, she would become the greatest warrior this galaxy had ever seen. The days began to blur together in the confines of the estate. Zyra was confined to a small, austere room. A space that felt more like a holding cell than the accommodations of someone who had just been purchased. It was functional, equipped with nothing more than a bed, a desk, and a few simple amenities. No windows, no luxuries, nothing to remind her of the life she once had. She had expected to be treated as little more than a slave, but there was an odd sense of purpose that lingered in the air, undeniable tension that whispered to her from every corner of the estate. The man, the one who had bought her, had not given her his name yet, but it was becoming clear that he had something in mind for her. Something beyond mere subjugation. The first few days were filled with tests, physical, psychological, and strategic. They weren't the kind of tests she had been subjected to before, those that stripped away her identity and left her broken and dependent. These were different. The man pushed her harder than anyone had before, demanding more than just obedience. He demanded strength, resilience, and, above all, self-discipline. She was forced into a rigorous training regime, her body stretched to its limits as she fought, ran, and trained under the strict supervision of the estate's enigmatic master. At first, she resisted, as she had with every other owner. She fought back, tried to break free of the shackles of her new reality. But this time was different. Each time she faltered, each time her body screamed for rest, the man simply watched, unflinching, his expression unreadable. It was clear he didn't intend to break her spirit, but to forge her into something far greater. Something with purpose. She wasn't a slave. Not here. The man had a plan, one that she couldn't yet understand, but he had made one thing clear. He saw in her potential. The brutal workouts, the endless sparring matches, the weapons training, it was all a means to an end. She had been sold as a broken warrior, a woman whose spirit was considered too fierce to control. But here, in the cold, sterile environment of the estate, he was slowly but surely pushing her to unlock the power that had been buried deep inside her, power that she had never fully harnessed. Zyra didn't know why she was willing to keep going. Maybe it was the sheer exhaustion of it all, the way it drowned out the pain of remembering who she used to be. Or maybe it was the tiny spark of hope that flickered inside her, the hope that she could finally find some purpose, even in this twisted reality. She had been discarded, left to die, and yet now she was being made into something else entirely, a weapon, a force of nature, a being who would strike fear into the hearts of those who once saw her as a mere tool. Every day, her body grew stronger. Every day, she felt herself becoming more than just a survivor. She was beginning to feel like herself again. The man, her master, for lack of a better term, had set her on a path, and though she hated every second of it, a part of her knew that this was the only chance she had to truly reclaim her power. But it wasn't easy. The pain was constant. The cuts and bruises on her body, the swelling in her muscles from overexertion, the exhaustion that made her vision blur, all of it was a constant reminder of the cost of this journey. Yet every time she fell, she picked herself up. Every time the man's cold gaze locked onto hers with a silent expectation, she fought harder. She was learning, adapting, becoming something new. "Focus," the man said one evening, his voice cutting through the silence of the gymnasium as she tried to catch her breath. The weight of the dumbbell in her hand was almost unbearable, her arms trembling from the strain. "You have the strength, but your mind isn't ready. I'm not training your body, I am training your resolve. Your mind is what will make you invincible." Zyra paused for a moment, staring at him with narrowed eyes. She was exhausted, every fiber of her being begging for rest. But she didn't rest. She couldn't. Her eyes flickered over to him, and she saw the same calmness in his posture, the same detachment that had been there since he first bought her. He was unlike any of the others. He wasn't angry, he wasn't cruel. He was focused, calculating. He wasn't just training her to be a weapon. He was training her to be something more. Her grip tightened on the dumbbell, and she raised it again, pushing her body to its limits. She could feel the strain, feel the weight, but she refused to stop. The man didn't care about her pain, about her exhaustion. What he cared about was her potential. He was forcing her to break through the mental barriers she had built up, the walls she had put up to protect herself from the world. He wasn't asking her to obey. He was asking her to surpass herself. Zyra gritted her teeth, her body screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not now. Chapter 3. The Test of Strength. Weeks passed in a blur of training. The days had become indistinguishable from each other, each one filled with endless physical conditioning, mental exercises, and hours spent with weapons training. The man, who still had not revealed his name, continued to push her, always one step ahead, always knowing exactly what she needed, even if she didn't. She had grown stronger, her body no longer shaking with exhaustion after every session. Her movements had become more fluid, her reactions sharper. But there was something else too, something in her that she had buried deep down for so long. She felt a fire inside of her, one that had been stoked by his relentless training and his unwavering belief in her. It was on the 50th day of her training that the true test came. The man called her into the main hall, a large, open space in the estate where he conducted his tests and simulations. There were no more drills, no more solitary exercises. This was different. This was the final assessment of everything she had learned. "Today," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge of anticipation, "you will prove that you are no longer just a slave, no longer just a warrior. You will prove that you are something more. Today, you will fight." Zyra's eyes narrowed, the words sparking a mixture of excitement and dread inside her. She had fought countless times before, battles that had shaped her into the warrior she had been. But this was different. She wasn't fighting for survival this time. She was fighting for something else, something deeper. "You're ready," the man continued, pacing slowly in front of her, his hands clasped behind his back. "The test won't be easy. You'll face an opponent who is just as skilled, just as powerful. You'll fight until the end. Zyra stood silently, her fists clenching at her sides, her muscles tight with anticipation. The man had trained her to be strong, but now, she had to prove that she had learned everything he had taught her. She could feel the adrenaline building, her body waking up to the challenge ahead. She had come too far to fail now. With a gesture, the man signaled for the opponent to be released. The door at the far end of the hall opened, and another figure stepped out into the open space. Zyra's breath caught in her throat. Her opponent was another Zavka, but this one was different, older, more experienced, and perhaps even stronger than she was. The Zavka woman locked eyes with her, a fierce determination in her gaze. This wasn't just a sparring match. This was a test of everything Zyra had learned. She could sense the challenge in her opponent's stance, the way she moved, the fluidity of her motions, the quiet confidence she radiated. It was a challenge Zyra was ready to accept. Fight, the man said simply. Without warning, the other Zavka charged, her powerful limbs propelling her forward with explosive force. Zyra barely had time to react before her opponent's fist collided with her chest, knocking the air from her lungs. But Zyra wasn't unprepared. She recovered quickly, using the momentum of the hit to roll to the side, narrowly avoiding the next strike. Her body moved almost instinctively, the training kicking in as she sidestepped the attack and launched her own counterattack. The fight was brutal, fast-paced, and unforgiving. Zyra's muscles screamed as she fought back with everything she had, her body moving with precision, her strikes landing with power and accuracy. Every move was calculated, every blow delivered with the strength she had honed over the past weeks. Her opponent was strong, but Zyra was faster, more agile, and above all, determined to prove that she was more than just a slave, more than just a failure. The battle raged on, the sounds of their blows echoing through the hall. Zyra's breath came in sharp gasps, but she pushed through, refusing to falter. And then, with one final, decisive move, she caught her opponent off guard, landing a blow that sent her sprawling to the floor. For a moment, everything was still. The man stood silently, watching from the sidelines as Zyra stood over her defeated opponent, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The battle had been won, and she had proven herself. "Well done," the man said, his voice soft, but filled with approval. "You've come further than I thought you could. But this is only the beginning." Zyra wiped the sweat from her brow, looking down at the fallen Zavka woman with a mixture of respect and gratitude. She had passed the test, but she knew that this was only the start of something much greater. She wasn't just a slave anymore. She was a warrior, and nothing would stand in her way. The room was silent, save for the steady echo of Zyra's breath. Her fists, now covered in bruises and scrapes, tightened as she stood over her fallen opponent. The Zavka woman, her opponent, was breathing heavily, lying in the middle of the combat floor, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Zyra's body burned with exhaustion, but there was something more now. Something that felt like victory, though it wasn't a feeling she was accustomed to. The fight had been brutal, unforgiving, and it had pushed her to the edge. But she had won. Kale's gaze never left her, his eyes scanning her with the same cold, calculating intensity that they always held. He wasn't smiling, but there was something about the way he stood, watching her from the shadows, that told her this wasn't about winning or losing. This was about proving that she could become more than just a slave, more than just a broken warrior. He was molding her, shaping her into something that could not be controlled. "Well done," Kale said finally, his voice low, almost a murmur, but filled with a quiet approval. He stepped toward her, his boots clicking softly against the floor as he approached. "But don't mistake this for an end. It's only the beginning." Zyra wiped the sweat from her brow, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at her lips. Her chest still burned with the adrenaline of the fight, but beneath it was something else, something she had been searching for since the moment she had been brought to this estate. Purpose. Control. The feeling of being more than just an object to be used. Kale hadn't just trained her body. He had given her a sense of power she hadn't felt in years. "Do you think I'm ready?" she asked, her voice hoarse but firm. There was no arrogance in her question, just the curiosity of someone who had finally found a glimmer of what they had been looking for. The glimmer of hope. Kale paused, his gaze flickering toward her with something unreadable in his eyes. He really looked at her for what seemed like an eternity. He was silent for a long time before answering, his voice as steady as it always was. "You've made progress," he said, his tone unchanging. "But this was just one test. There's more to becoming a warrior than just physical strength. You have to learn to command, to lead." Zyra felt a chill run through her at his words. Led? She had never been taught to lead. She had always been the one following, the one fighting for survival, the one who had been tossed from owner to owner, never allowed the freedom to make her own choices. To lead was something she had never considered. But now, it seemed that Kale had a different vision for her. A vision that didn't just involve fighting, it involved controlling, commanding, making decisions that could affect more than just herself. Zyra straightened, brushing the dust from her clothes. She had to admit, part of her liked the idea. She didn't just want to be a weapon. She wanted to be more. She wanted to be the one making the decisions, the one in control. But could she? Could someone like her, someone who had been broken by so many, ever really become the leader Kale seemed to think she could be? "Are you ready for that?" Kale asked, his voice cutting through her thoughts, his eyes still studying her carefully. The responsibility? The weight of command. Zyra paused, thinking for a moment. She had spent her life surviving. She had fought for her freedom, only to be sold again and again. But now, she was being given the opportunity to shape her own future. She could feel it in the air, the shift, the change in her life. She could become something different, something greater. "Yes," she answered quietly, but firmly. "I'm ready." Kale nodded, a small, approving gesture. "Then it's time to begin." Chapter 4, A New Beginning. The weeks that followed were the most grueling of Zyra's life. Kale didn't relent. He didn't go easy on her. Every day was filled with physical challenges, mental exercises, and tactical training. But there was something new now, something deeper. This wasn't just about fighting anymore. It wasn't just about training her body to be stronger, faster, and more powerful. It was about teaching her how to think, how to lead. Zyra spent hours in strategic sessions, studying tactics from wars fought in other galaxies, learning how to manage resources, how to read people, how to see the world through the eyes of a leader. It was exhausting, but exhilarating. She had never thought she could do something like this, never thought she could take on the mantle of responsibility. But each day, she grew stronger, more confident in her ability to think, to plan, to command. It was during one of these late-night strategy sessions that Kale finally revealed something that took Zyra by surprise. He had been quiet throughout the training, but tonight, as they reviewed a particularly brutal battle plan, he spoke. "You're ready," he said suddenly, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Tomorrow, we leave." Zyra looked up, confusion crossing her face. "Leave? Leave where?" "To the front lines," Kale replied simply. "I've been building a force that needs someone who understands how to lead, how to fight, and how to command. I'm offering you a chance to lead that force." Zyra's heart skipped a beat. "You want me to lead your army?" Kale nodded, his expression unwavering. "Not just an army. A rebellion. A chance to take back what was taken from us. You've proven yourself worthy. You've proven that you can lead." Zyra stood, her mind racing with the implications of his words. A rebellion. She had never thought of herself as a leader of a movement, but she had already fought for so long, survived for so long, that the idea felt strangely natural. This was what she had been training for all along, not just to fight, but to build, to command, to lead people into battle for a cause she could believe in. "I've given you the skills you need," Kale continued, his voice firm. "The question now is, will you take the chance? Will you lead?" Zyra thought about everything she had been through, everything she had learned. She thought about the warriors of her people, the Zavka, who had been lost to war, to oppression. She thought about her own battles, her survival, her resilience, and for the first time, the weight of leadership didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an honor. It felt like her destiny. "I'll lead," she said, her voice steady, her decision clear. "I'll lead your rebellion." Kale smiled, the corners of his lips curling into a rare expression of approval. "Then, it begins tomorrow." The next morning, Zyra stood before a group of soldiers, her heart beating with the power of her decision. These weren't just any soldiers. They were fighters, rebels, outcasts who had joined Kale's cause in hopes of finding something they could fight for. Now, Zyra stood before them, not as a slave, not as a warrior on the run, but as their leader. She wasn't just a tool anymore. She was a force. "You've all come here for a reason," Zyra began, her voice cutting through the air, strong and clear. "You're here because you're willing to fight for something greater than yourselves. We're going to take back what's ours. We're going to fight for freedom. And I'll lead you." Her words rang out with a power she hadn't known she had. She wasn't just leading an army, she was leading a movement, a rebellion against those who had sought to use them as nothing more than pawns. She wasn't just a weapon anymore. She was a symbol, a leader. The men and women around her nodded, their eyes filled with determination. They weren't following her just because she was strong or because she had proven herself in battle. They were following her because they believed in her. They believed in her vision. They believed in her leadership. And in that moment, Zyra knew that this was where she truly belonged. She wasn't a slave. She wasn't a broken warrior. She was the leader of a rebellion, a force to be reckoned with. The battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but Zyra was ready. And this time, she wasn't fighting alone. She was fighting for something bigger, for herself, for her people, for the future, and she would lead them all to victory.